In my Sonic Adventure 2 video, I said that I thought it was very strange that they decided to make the ranking system in that game about getting a good score rather than getting a good time. I said that because the Sonic games have always been built to encourage you to try to play them as quickly as possible, and I thought the most natural thing to do would be to have a ranking system that is based on how quickly you can complete the level, and not how many points you can get by the time you get to the end. That just didn't make any sense to me. But upon watching a video from Alex Yard called "You Have Only Played 25% of Sonic 3, I have come to realize that playing for score is actually how the original Sonic games were always designed, and that SA2's ranking system was actually a natural continuation of what the original Sonic games always wanted you to do. This came as a total revelation to me, as I have always thought of the Sonic games as being built purely for going for speed, and they are still largely about that because of the existence of the time bonus in those games. You are still encouraged to beat the levels as quickly as possible to get the biggest time bonus possible, and thus that is why the level design is constructed in such a way that it encourages replays and learning the levels and finding the fastest routes. Everything that I have been saying in my videos is still true, but as Alex points out in his video, there are many elements of the level design and general design of the Sonic games that are very explicitly and obviously put there to encourage you to try to get a good score. His video is very, very interesting. I'll have a link to it in the description, as well as a link to his main channel where he does really interesting music theory breakdowns of video game music, primarily the Sonic games. You should definitely go check that out. I don't even know anything about music, but I find his videos very interesting. Anyway, yeah, the Sonic games actually would encourage you to go for score. The two major things that really opened my mind to this was, one, there's a lot of setups in the games that are explicitly there for you to get score by doing things in chains. One big example here is the famous Marble Zone breaking block sequence. Doing this is actually very bad for getting a good time. If you want to get a good time here, you just break a straight line right down. But you get more and more score the more of these things that you break. Why would this be here if not to encourage you to try to break them all in one sequence? You also have many enemy setups in the games that are very explicitly built for you to try to bounce on them all in one sequence to get a combo chain. For example, here at the opening of Act 1 of Palm Tree Panic, you have these two enemies floating up here, and they're not really a threat to you. If you just hold right, then they're not going to hit you. What are these here for if they're not actually a threat? And for that matter, what is this platform here at the beginning here for? There's nothing up here. Well, this platform and those enemies are there, so that way you can jump up to the platform and use this to bounce off the two enemies and get some points for doing a combo chain right there. That is the only reason that could possibly be there, and so that must be the reason that is there, in order for you to get points. This is actually something I directly talked about in my Sonic Adventure 2 video, that they would present you with scoring opportunities where this only exists to give you a reason to try to get score in this moment, and as it turns out, this kind of design was present all the way back to the very beginning of Sonic. The reason I never really picked up on this stuff before is because the time bonus is such a hugely influential element to how the Sonic levels are designed, that I only ever saw that part of them. I only saw the speedrunning element of the game's design. And all of the other elements of the design I assumed were only there for trying to get Chaos Emeralds and special stages. You know, the monitors off in the side areas that you can get for rings and shields and all that. I just figured that was to give you plenty of opportunities to get the 50 rings you need to access the special stages and turn into Supersonic and all that. But the biggest thing that really opened my eyes to the idea of these Sonic games always having been about score is the boss fights. Because the bosses in Sonic have always been very exploitable, where if you just use your invincibility frames, you can just take as many hits as you want and kill the boss very quickly and easily. However, beating bosses like this is not the intention. You're supposed to be trying to beat these bosses without taking a hit, so that way you can get the ring bonus at the end of the level. And yes, I'm calling them rings here. That joke is exclusive to Sonic Was Always Good, so here I'm gonna be calling them rings. So yeah, the existence of the ring bonus encourages you to try to beat these bosses without taking a hit, which makes the design of them a lot better. I mean, the bosses still are very flawed in many ways just because of how they're fundamentally designed, but their biggest issue of being able to just exploit invincibility frames and recollecting your one ring over and over to basically make yourself unkillable, that goes away when you actually try to play for score, and suddenly the design of these bosses makes a lot more sense. So upon realizing this stuff, I absolutely do think that playing for score has always been the intention of the original Sonic games. And in a similar way to what I've talked about in playing for time in previous Sonic videos, if you don't play Sonic games for score, then there is a lot of the elements of the game that you are just missing out on. You know, you never learn how to beat the bosses without taking a hit, and all these enemy setups that you're meant to try to bounce across, they don't serve any purpose to you anymore, and so there's a lot of the gameplay and game design here that you just don't play if you don't play for score. So now my question becomes, if that was always the intention of the games, why does nobody do it, and why has no one ever really talked about it prior to Alex Yard's video? And I think the answer is pretty obvious, which is that score is generally just not a very enticing thing for players. That's not even really a subjective thing, that's kind of just a truth that players, a lot of them, just don't care about score. This is not something that is exclusive to Sonic. You know, lots of old school games had scoring systems, and players just did not care about them. And the reason for that, I think, is pretty self-explanatory, because score originated in the arcades, and in a lot of those old school arcade games, really the only thing to do was to go for a high score. You know, if you play something like Pac-Man, there is only getting a good score in that game. There's nothing else to do. It's just trying to get the best score you can, and playing it over and over to try to improve your score, and, you know, aiming for the high score. That's what a lot of old school arcade games were built on. But then, over time, some games started to introduce the idea of being able to beat the game. Things like shmups and beat-em-ups and games like that. These games, in addition to aiming for a high score, had an ending that you could actually complete. And this adds a second objective to playing the game. Instead of just aiming for a high score, you now can also attempt to beat the game. However, in these old games where you had lives and game overs and continues where you could just pump quarters into the machine and keep going, there was really no accomplishment for beating the game. You could just keep pumping quarters into the machine and you could beat the game no matter how bad you were. However, the fact that you had to pay money to keep playing is what encouraged players to try to get better at the game and beat it for less and less money. Ideally, you could beat the game on just 1 credit. And so this is where the idea of the 1cc, the 1 credit clear, starts to crop up in shmups and beat-em-ups and games like that. Now the idea becomes getting better and better at the game and playing it over and over until you're good enough that you can beat it in just 1 credit. And this whole objective is now entirely separate from getting a good score. Granted, you will generally get a good score if you can complete a game like this in 1 credit, but it's not necessarily mandatory, and you can just aim for the 1 credit clear without really thinking about score at all. And that is naturally an objective that players are going to care more about in the arcades when they have to pay to play the game when they game over. Now we move this over to console games where you can no longer pay for continues, and continues are earned through gameplay. Now beating the game in and of itself is an accomplishment, and so now that becomes a greater focus for players, is just beating the game now takes on that same type of motivation that getting a 1 credit clear did in the arcade games. Score was still there and present in a lot of home console games for a while, but players generally would overlook it, I think, because beating the game is a much more tangible goal. Like, with a score, there's nothing really particularly to aim for, it's just a number, and it's kind of just a metric of your performance. And yeah, you could try to get a better score and thus get better at the game, but generally most players aren't really that enticed by that kind of thing. A lot of players don't really care that much about actively trying to improve and get better at a game. Most people just want to play the game and see it to the end, and so the simple act of beating the game is a much more compelling goal than aiming for score. And this is even more so the case in the Sonic games because they have an additional objective on top of beating the game, which is collecting the Chaos Emeralds. If you beat a Sonic game, then it doesn't tell you what your score is and say, hey, try to aim for a better score next time. No, it says try to get the Chaos Emeralds. And by collecting the Chaos Emeralds, you get access to the good ending or the final boss or whatever. So not only does the game explicitly tell you, hey, try to do this, but it implicitly tells you to do this because you get rewards for getting the Chaos Emeralds, whereas you don't get rewards for trying to get a good score. And the sad truth is that if you don't extrinsically motivate players to do something in a game, most of the time players aren't really going to do it. I've talked about in my videos a couple of times how I like to time attack Sonic games not for the time itself or for trying to get a good ranking or whatever. I do it just because I find it fun. I get the intrinsic enjoyment of the experience of doing it. That is my motivation to do it. But for most people, they need that carrot on the end of the stick to make them do things in a lot of games. So the Sonic games being built around score but having absolutely nothing encouraging the player to do it, I would argue that is actually a flaw in the game's design. I mean, just look at the Metroid games. Those are games that have always encouraged players to complete the games as quickly as possible, and they do have a motivation in the game for you to do it because the game tracks your completion record and your completion time, and it will give you a different ending picture depending on how quickly you can complete the game. And that gives players, even just something small like that, an extrinsic motivation that makes them actively want to try to get better and better at the game and complete it faster and faster. And eventually the Sonic games did realize this by implementing the ranking system in Sonic Adventure 2. Suddenly, in Sonic Adventure 2, players care about getting a good score in those levels to get those A ranks. The A ranks is now a proper motivation that makes players play for score when they did not care about it previously. If the original Sonic games were designed around score, which I definitely think they were, they really should have implemented something to encourage players to go for score. Either a ranking system or some kind of little bonus cutscene you got at the end of the game for achieving a certain score. Something, anything that would encourage players to actively go for this, rather than just their own intrinsic desire to go for a high score, because most players just aren't going to do that. However, as someone that can enjoy a game purely on the fun of playing it, upon watching Alex's video, I was very, very encouraged to try playing the original Sonic games for score. I wanted to see what kind of experience that was, and what I found was something very, very surprising. I got a fair amount of criticism in my Sonic Adventure 2 video in the comments from people saying that they prefer the games being built around score, because if you just play the Sonic games for time, then you inevitably end up just running past a lot of the stuff because it ends up slowing you down, and so there's a lot of gameplay that you end up overlooking in those games, and that they prefer a scoring system rather than a time-based system because it encourages you not to just play quickly, but also to do all of these challenges along the way that end up encouraging you to play in a stylish and cool way. And I don't really agree with the former argument there, because if the game was designed entirely for time from the ground up, then there would not be things there that slow you down. Anything that you're meant to interact with would speed you up, because otherwise it would have no reason to be there. And you can see this in certain Sonic games that are built purely for time. For example, Sonic Unleashed on Wii. That game has no scoring system, its ranking system is based entirely on time, and so all of its level design is built around speeding the player up. Anything that slows you down in that game is a hazard that's meant to be avoided. So I do still think that a design built purely around time could work for Sonic. But also on the latter argument, where a scoring system encourages you to not just play fast, but also do challenges along the way to get score, I have found that if you really want to get a good score in Sonic games, that is not actually the case most of the time. Sometimes it is, specifically in levels where you can get the 50,000 point time bonus, because in the original Sonic games, the way it worked was that you would get a time bonus based on how quickly you can complete the level within certain thresholds. If you can complete the level in under 30 seconds or under a minute in the case of Sonic 3 and Knuckles, you would get a 50,000 point time bonus. However, if you missed that threshold, then you would go all the way down to a 10,000 point time bonus, which is a significant score loss, and so you are definitely encouraged in the scoring system to try to complete levels within that 30-second or 1-minute window. However, there are a lot of levels in the original Sonic games that are simply too long to possibly complete in those thresholds, And so in these levels, the best time bonus you can possibly get is a 10,000 point time bonus. The thing about that is that 10,000 points is only the equivalent of 100 rings. And if you're trying to play in a balanced way where you play for both score and time together, then you're probably going to complete the levels with around like 70 to maybe 150 rings, you know, somewhere around that ballpark. However, a lot of these levels will have upwards of 200, 300, even over like 500 rings. And so if you think about it, if you complete the level with say 100 rings and you get a 10,000 point time bonus, that is 20,000 points. However, if you complete the level with 400 rings and no time bonus, that is 40,000 points, and that is a much, much larger score. And that would mean that playing for time at all actually has no bearing on getting a good score in the Sonic games, and that is exactly what I found in my testing playing Angel Island Act 2 trying to get a good score. At first I tried to play in a balanced way where I would play for both score and time, and I would get a pretty decent score at the end of it. However, then I started to completely forego time and just try to get the best score I possibly could, and as you can see at the end result, I would get a way, way higher score at the very end. I did still manage to get a 2,000 point time bonus for completing the level as quickly as I did, but that is only because Sonic 3 Air actually adjusted the time system in the game. In the original Sonic 3 and Knuckles, I would actually have gotten the minimum time bonus if you take, I think, more than 3 minutes to complete the level, which means that in the design of the original games, getting a good score means completely foregoing playing the game quickly and trying to get a good time, and it purely becomes about exploring the entire level and trying to get all the rings you can and kill all the enemies you can. Which actually becomes kind of interesting, because in my Sonic 2 video, I talked about how people always say that the Sonic games are about exploration, but I never really agreed with that because there was never anything of value for you to collect. I mean, what would you get? Ring monitors, shields, extra lives, nothing that actually really mattered. However, suddenly these things do matter if you're trying to play for score. And so now, if you're trying to get a good score, then the gameplay entirely changes to a very explorative gameplay style that is entirely different to trying to play the game for getting a good time. And I must admit that it actually was pretty fun playing in this radically different method. It was very different than what I'm used to. You know, there's so many parts of these levels that I just never go to when I'm trying to complete them as quickly as possible. But now suddenly I'm playing in a way that encourages me to go to every part of the level, which was very, very fun, actually. And so this whole thing made me start to wonder that what is actually the intention of these original Sonic games? Are they supposed to encourage you to play in a balanced method where you try to go for score and time? That feels like how it's supposed to be, considering that the time bonus is there. Naturally, its existence would encourage you to go for it, right? But then the actual scoring system overall doesn't encourage you to go for it. Is this just an oversight in how the scoring system is designed? I guess it could be, but I find that hard to believe considering how immaculately well done the overall level design of Sonic 3 and Knuckles is. But at the same time, everything I've talked about in my videos in regards to time attack with the Sonic games is still true. The multi-tiered level design where the harder paths are up top and they'll get you a faster clear time and all that, that is still absolutely true, but that entire design becomes entirely pointless in the game's scoring system. So why is that even there? The more and more I examine the level design of the original Sonic games, the more I'm led to believe that time and score are actually supposed to be two separate objectives in the game. I am led to believe that playing for score is intended for you to explore the entire level and take your time, but at the same time, the existence of the level design that is clearly built to encourage you to try to play the level as quickly as possible, that also leads me to believe that playing for time is also something that the game is encouraging you to do. One thing that makes me think this is that there's a lot of intended shortcuts in the level design that, if you're playing for a good score, become entirely pointless. It actually becomes better to take the slower path because you can get more score if you go that way. For example, at the end of Green Hill Act 1, you have the tubes you go through and then they launch you off this ramp high up into the air. And this is a passivity trap. If you let the level play itself and launch you up high, then that is slower than if you actively jump over this ramp, and now you have a straight shot to the end of the level, which will give you a faster clear time. What's weird is that if you do take that ramp, there's a bunch of rings and enemies and ring monitors that you can get that will give you a much better score than if you take the shortcut. So if the design of the game is encouraging me to play for score, then why is that shortcut even there when you actually don't want to take it? The better thing to do is to intentionally fall into this trap, and that is very strange. You'd think that if the game's design was encouraging a balance between score and time, then the best scoring opportunities would also be on the route that would get you through the level the fastest, but that is not the case. The level design is pulling you in two different directions. Another thing that makes me think that these are supposed to be two separate objectives is that in Sonic Adventure, when they started recording your data on how you perform through the level, they recorded your score and time as two separate values, which means that it is recording two separate things that you can go for. It does also record your best rings for the level, but that is directly tied to getting a good score, whereas getting a good time is not. And so I don't think that playing for score is the way that the Sonic games were intended to be played. I think that they were intentionally built in such a way that they encourage players to play the game in whatever way they want to. If you just want to beat the game, then the game's design supports that. If you want to get the Chaos Emeralds, then its design supports that as well. If you want to try to get a good score, then there's a lot of design there that encourages that as well. And if you want to try to speedrun the game, then the level design also encourages that style of play. And the intention was that the player was entirely free to play however they wanted to. Another thing I've noticed is that the scoring systems in many Sonic games actually discourage a balance of playing for score and time at once, including Sonic Adventure 2, which is a game I've been told by many people that that's the point of the scoring system. Having played that game a little bit, really trying to get the best score I possibly can, I've noticed that getting a good score encourages a lot of very bizarre player behavior that definitely was not intentional. And this is one of the problems that I have with scoring systems where you get score for the sake of score. To me, the best scoring systems are ones that you don't actually have to do anything to get a good score in the game. You will naturally get a good score by simply playing the game well. When games use score as a motivating factor where they encourage you to do things in the game purely because it will give you a better score, I've found that almost always scoring systems like this are somehow flawed and abusable in some kind of way. For example, in this game called Aragami, this is a stealth game, and in the original game's scoring system, you would get 100 points for killing an enemy, which I think is perfectly fine. You know, you get a stealth kill on a guy, that's a good thing, you get some points for that. But then you would also get 25 points for destroying the body, which on paper seems like it makes sense, because getting rid of bodies is a good thing to do in stealth games. It makes it so no one can find it and then you won't get caught. So naturally, with the scoring system, you would want to encourage players to hide bodies. However, the problem with this is that there are many situations where you have no reason to hide a body. If you've already killed all the dudes in the area and you've killed the last guy, there's no reason to hide his body. Or if you've just killed a guy that you know for certain no other guards come in this area and no one is ever going to see this body, you have no reason to hide it. But you are still motivated to hide the body anyway because it would give you points. The end result of this is that after you would kill all the dudes in the area, instead of just moving on to the next area and continuing on with the gameplay, you would stop and go back and dissolve all of the bodies for no reason, just to get those extra points, as you needed them in order to get an S rank with the game's ranking system. This really cuts into the pace of the game and is boring, and it sucks. And it is in no way benefiting the stealth gameplay of the game, and I don't think that it is the intention of the design of the game. And I actually brought this up to the developers of the game, and they eventually patched it and removed score for hiding bodies, making it so that your only motivation to hide the bodies is the intrinsic value of them not getting found. That kind of thing is in general why I don't really like scoring systems in games. They are very, very easy to exploit unless they are very, very carefully designed. And there are some Sonic games that do a better job with their scoring systems. For example, with Sonic Adventure Onward, they got rid of the idea of thresholds with the time bonus, where instead of completing the level under 30 seconds to get a certain time bonus, it is instead that your time directly equates to score, and so every second you spend, you're losing points. And so even if you do want to slow down to do all these things to get score, you're still encouraged to do it in a speedy way. But a game like Sonic Rush improves upon this much further, because its time bonus is not based on a specific time like the original Sonic games were. Instead, the maximum time bonus you can get in that game is unique for every single level. So one level might have the maximum time bonus possible. You achieve it by beating it in 1 minute and 20 seconds, whereas another level it might be 2 minutes, whereas another level it might be 2 minutes and 45 seconds, and so on and so forth. Each individual level's time bonus was specifically tailored to that level to make it so that you are always encouraged to try to play the game quickly and not do this weird exploratory gameplay that you find in the earlier games, which can be a good thing or bad thing depending on whether or not you think this gameplay is good for the games. But even then, I would still prefer there just not being a scoring system at all, and instead we motivate players to do these kinds of things through the gameplay. Sonic Advance 2 was one game that I thought really improved upon this, with the boost mode and the fact that you can activate it sooner with the more rings you have. This is an intrinsic motivation to the player that actually benefits you in the gameplay to collect as many rings as possible and avoid taking hits so you can keep them. You're not just doing it because it gives you a score bonus, you're doing it because it will let you get through the level faster this way. That is much better to me and leads to a more focused and functioning design. If you still want to have this type of gameplay where it encourages players to really explore the entire level and collect all the rings and stuff like that, I think you could still do that with other types of things. For example, Sonic Adventure had those 2 extra missions you could go for once you've completed a level. One mission was to complete the level in under a certain time, which I think if those times were just a bit stricter, that would be a great thing to motivate players to try to play for time. But then the other mission in that game was to complete the level with 50 rings, which is an entirely stupid mission because you're gonna easily get 50 rings just naturally playing the level, and so you'll easily beat it as long as you don't take a hit toward the end. But I think this mission could easily be fixed if you had it so that instead of collecting 50 rings, you had to complete the level with 500 rings or whatever. You know, again, tailor it to the specific level and its amount of rings, and that would encourage you to really explore the whole thing and collect as many rings as you can. You could even still encourage things like enemy chains by having it so that you get rings for killing enemies, and the bigger your chain, the more rings you get for every enemy killed, kind of like what's done in Rodea the Sky Soldier. So upon all of this further analysis and looking into these Sonic games, I have come to the conclusion that I think more than ever, actually, that the scoring system really is not very good for Sonic, and I do think it is a flaw with the game's design. I think everything that the game's designs try to encourage could be achieved with better ways that are less exploitable and less flawed, and would also better motivate the players to actually go for these things. And this was a very, very interesting discovery. I must thank Alex Yard very much for his video. It really opened my mind up to an entirely new way to enjoy these Sonic games, and I actually must say I am actually interested now in going back to the original Sonic games and SA1 and trying to do score runs and seeing how good of a score I can get in those earlier games. It might actually be pretty fun. And just being able to learn something new about the original Sonic games at this point for me is pretty mind-blowing when you think about it. I mean, these are 30-year-old games, and I have played these for literally my entire life. I have played these games dozens and dozens and dozens of times, and I am still learning new things about them. It just goes to show how much there is to these Sonic games. And to think, some people try to say that Sonic was never good. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed and learned something from this video. If you did and you'd like to support me, there will be a link to my Ko-fi page in the description. I'll see you next time.